Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin has decided to allow several of the Fed's emergency lending programs to expire on December 31st. That could reduce the central bank's ability to backstop the financial system, but the Fed will still have arrows in its quiver. Steve Leisman joins us with more. Steve.
Good morning, Wolf. Yeah, after working closely together for much of this crisis, the Fed and the Treasury publicly parting ways yesterday with a surprise decision by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin not to extend several of the Fed's emergency lending programs. In a letter that surprised the central bank, Mnuchin wrote to Fed Chair Jay Powell, quote, "I am requesting that the Federal Reserve return the unused funds to the Treasury." And then, in a rare public rebuke of the Treasury, the Fed responded, quote, "The Federal Reserve would prefer that the full suite of emergency facilities established during the coronavirus pandemic continue to serve their important role as a backstop for our still strained and vulnerable economy." That just doesn't happen. This public spat here. The $429 billion that the Fed must now give back to the Treasury has backed up could have backed up more than $4 trillion of loans into the economy, including loans to the muni and corporate bond markets and loans to medium-sized businesses. Several economists and business groups joined the Fed in criticizing the decision. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce saying it, quote, "prematurely and unnecessarily ties the hands of the incoming administration." Oxford Economics writing, "In the absence of fiscal aid, the decision to curtail the Fed's firepower could unsettle markets and exacerbate economic stress." The programs were little used, loaning just out $25 billion out so far, but they were credited with calming financial markets roiled by the pandemic. Sources tell CNBC, though, that the Fed could still have the ability to loan out some $750 billion, but any new lending now after December 31st requires approval from the Treasury Secretary, either this one or the next one. Wilf?
Hey, Steve, just walk us through the thinking inside the Treasury. Walk us through the thinking of Steven Mnuchin and what the thought was inside the Treasury Department to do this, because there's a lot of views and a lot of people ascribing lots of different motivations, some political, some others, to this decision.
Well, I think there's a charitable explanation. There's a less charitable explanation. The Treasury Secretary looks at financial markets right now and sees that they're behaving rather well. The Treasury Secretary looked at what he believed to be the intent of Congress. The Fed disagrees with that and says these programs are supposed to expire December 31st, and I'm going to follow the intent of Congress. The less charitable explanation is that by taking this money away, he gives less flexibility to the incoming administration to change these programs and perhaps loan more money out into the economy. One more thing, which is that, as I said, under a new agreement with the Fed, there is considerable lending power on the part of the central bank. That said, it requires a new agreement with the Treasury Secretary. What would precipitate that? Well, it would be perhaps a new financial panic. The Fed was like, well, let's not wait till a new financial panic happens to put these programs back into place. Let's leave them up and running.
Hey, Steve, when you talk to people who really understand financial markets, there are a couple of concerns that come with this. The first is the idea that if you have these programs, it's kind of like what Hank Paulson said back in the financial crisis. If you've got a bazooka in your pocket and everybody knows it, you don't always have to use it. It also gets to the point of who the next Secretary of the Treasury is going to be, because we know that President-elect Joe Biden has said he has somebody in mind who he thinks is going to please all sides of this debate, both sides of his party, the progressives and the more moderate Democrats that are out there. But the progressives have said they don't want anybody with any Wall Street experience in there. And if you talk to people who really understand markets, that scares them. If you have a Treasury Secretary who doesn't understand how the markets start to react in a time of panic, and given where we're headed with this country, with the COVID cases that are out there, with the potential for government shutdowns or the potential for consumers just to decide that they don't want to go out and they don't want to go to stores and they don't want to go to restaurants, what that will mean potentially for the markets in the meantime. That was a stabilizing force. You need somebody, you need these programs there, and you need a Treasury Secretary who understands the markets and has some experience.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really cogent analysis of the situation, Becky, and let me try to pick that apart just a bit. In the first instance, I expect the Treasury Secretary will be appointed who will know about markets. There's plenty of people out there, and I think that there are Democrats who I've spoken to who share that concern. And I don't think that Biden's going to ignore that issue, especially not right now in the middle of a pandemic. There's a stable of people who could take that job that aren't coming directly from Wall Street, but do understand markets. For example, Lael Brainerd would be a person who would understand markets. Janet Yellen is a person who would understand markets and has shown that. In addition, I think it's probably not crazy to believe that on January 21st, there's this $50 billion pot of money. Some people say it's a $70 billion. I count it as 50. We can debate that point. What's $20 billion among friends? Anyway, there's $50 billion of money in a thing called the Exchange Stabilization Fund. On January 21st, if the incoming administration believes it's the right call, the Treasury Secretary, the new one, can call up Powell and say, let's restart these programs with $50 billion that if you leverage up 10 to 1, creates the possibility of $500 billion of lending if it's needed. The only question about that is this 20-day period between the end of the programs and the new administration taking office, where those programs will not exist. But people I've spoken to in the market, some high-level financial people in the market, high-level bankers, they say the market doesn't care if they don't exist. They just want the possibility that they could exist, and that does still exist.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.